Welcome. The Thames River Heritage Park is pleased to present another of our virtual Stories from the Park, Eugene O'Neill's New London. I'm Amy Perry, Executive Director of the Foundation, and I want to thank you for joining us. The Thames River Heritage Park Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote, support, and sustain the Thames River Heritage Park, a collection of heritage sites linked by water that capture the history and culture of life along the Thames River. In collaboration with more than 20 institutional and heritage partners, we carry out our mission through educational and historic boat and walking tours, through our popular hop-on, hop-off water taxi, which ferries passengers to various historic sites within the park, our audio self-guided tours, and our quests, as well as events like this. Eugene O'Neill's New London explores New London at the turn of the 20th century and the influence the city and community had on the Pulitzer and Nobel Prize-winning playwright Eugene O'Neill. It's my pleasure to introduce our lecturer, Rob Richter. Rob is Director of Arts Programming at Connecticut College, where he curates the onStage performing arts series and teaches a seminar, Eugene O'Neill's America. He directed the 8-month Eugene O'Neill's New London celebration in 2000, advised the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center on their annual O'Neill celebration, and has contributed essays to numerous books on O'Neill. His own book, Eugene O'Neill and Davil, was a finalist in the 2005 Connecticut Book Award. He serves on the board of the Eugene O'Neill Society and chaired the Society's international conference held in New London in 2014. Rob has served as an advisory for the New England Foundation for the Arts National Theater Project. He received a BA from Connecticut College and has an MLS from Wesleyan University. At the end of Rob's talk, he'll be taking audience questions through the chat feature, so please feel free to enter your questions at any time. We hope you enjoy Eugene O'Neill's New London.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me now. And let me just make some adjustments here. All right. So to best view this program, you should probably go into speaker view. I'll be sharing my screen, but welcome everyone. My goal with today's talk is to give you a sense of Eugene O'Neill's life in New London and how New London influenced the playwright. The image you see here is of young Eugene at the age of 7 overlooking the Thames River. Some have said that he was writing a poem in this picture, but others say he was more likely drawing something like a tree. Before I talk specifically about New London and it's important to give a background and framework of Eugene O'Neill's life. The image you see here was taken of Eugene in 1916 in Provincetown, Massachusetts, when O'Neill was 27 years old. O'Neill was born in New York City on October 16, 1888, and died in Boston in November of 1953 at the age of 65. His parents were James and Mary Ellen O'Neill, but everyone referred to his mother as Ella. James was a well-known actor in his day. O'Neill had an older brother, James Jr., who was referred to as Jamie, who was 10 years older than Eugene. Eugene and Jamie had another brother, Edmund, but Edmund died 3 years before Eugene's birth from the measles at the age of 2. O'Neill began to write his plays in 1913, and his first play to be produced was Bounties for Cardiff in Provincetown in the summer of 1916. O'Neill went on to win 4 Pulitzer Prizes, one for first for Beyond the Horizon in 1920, Anna Christie in 1921, Strange Interlude in 1928, and Long Day's Journey into Night, which was written in 1941, but not released and produced until 1956, 3 years after O'Neill's death. O'Neill was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1936 and remains the only American playwright to have been honored with that award. The Nobel Prize is given for an individual's body of work, and many say that O'Neill wrote his best plays after being awarded the Nobel Prize. The significance of O'Neill in the American theater is that he is credited with creating a new American theater, a theater of realism, which is commonplace today, but was revolutionary in the early 20th century. He paved the way for other great American playwrights such as Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Edward Albee, Tony Kushner, and many, many more. The image you see here is taken from the Groton side of the Thames River, looking towards New London from Fort Griswold around 1905. You can see barges and schooners anchored in the river. New London, Connecticut is located at the mouth of the Thames River at the eastern end of Long Island Sound and is situated on one of the deepest and most sheltered natural harbors on North America's Atlantic coast. From its founding in 1646 and into the 20th century, the city has turned to the sea for its livelihood. During the colonial period, New Londoners were engaged in trade with the West Indies, carrying local produce and livestock and returning with sugar, molasses, and rum. The trade was disrupted by the Revolutionary War and never really recovered. In the early 19th century, New London turns its attention to whaling, which proved to be very profitable. New London evolved into the second largest whaling port in North America, and whalers continued to sail from the city into the early 20th century. The photograph you see here is of Captain James W. Buddington, who is a large man in the front of the group, just left of center. The crew of the whaling ship, the Margaret, taken in September of 1908. The Margaret was the last whaling ship out of New London and returned from her last voyage in 1909. O'Neill's early one-act play Isle, written in 1917, is set on board a whaling ship, and the plot and the characters are based on a Provincetown whaling captain and his wife. But O'Neill drew on his knowledge of New London whaling when he wrote the play. He also uses the name of Keeney for the captain and his wife in Isle. James O'Neill, Eugene's father, had a friend in New London with the last name of Keeney, who was a retired captain and had a fishmonger business. Throughout O'Neill's plays, he draws on people and places that were familiar to him for inspiration. The photograph you see here is of boats moored in the Thames River, a clear indication of how much the river was utilized. And this is along Pequot Avenue. During the O'Neill family's years in New London, the city was a maritime community in transition, shifting from primary dependence on the sea to a mixed reliance on industry and transportation. One of the significant businesses in New London at the time was the Thames Towboat Company, which in 1903 launched the tug Paul Jones, which was the largest and fastest tug to be built to date. The picture you see here is of New London's Jibboom Club parade. The Jibboom Club was originally founded in 1871 as a fraternal organization that was dedicated to providing social engagement for its members. Initially, the members were retired officers of whaling ships, but over the years, they relaxed their membership criteria. And one of the club's annual events was a parade. The club finally disbanded in 1959, and I believe the Customs House Museum, which is located on Bank Street today, has an exhibit honoring the Jibboom Club. New London's sea heritage was evident at every turn, from derelict ships that lay in the harbor to the steady traffic of fishing vessels, steamers, barges, yachts, and revenue cutters on the Thames River, to the palatial homes built from whaling money and the social clubs and other establishments that catered to seafaring men. The families The families that had made, and in some cases lost, their money from the sea remained in New London, and so did their stories, both mundane and heroic. And all of these things influenced O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill's parents, James and Ella O'Neill, pictured here, purchased 2 adjacent pieces of property on Pequot Avenue in New London in 1884. James' career as an actor in the theater was on the rise. He had stepped into the role of Edmond Dantes in the New York production of The Count of Monte Cristo the year before, and it was a huge success. James and Ella already had friends and family living in New London. Ella's mother had recently moved to New London to be near her sister, and James' friend John McGinley was working as a reporter for the New London Day. The McGinley family served as inspiration for the Miller family in O'Neill's play All Wilderness, which is his only comedy and was first produced in 1933. One of the properties contained a small house, which the neighbors referred to as the Pink House due to its color, and the other property contained a store and a barn. James made arrangements for work to be done on the Pink House so that it would be more comfortable as a summer residence for the family. He intended to rent the other property. The O'Neills did not take up residence at the Pink House until the end of the summer of 1887, a year prior to Eugene O'Neill's birth. It's important to note that due to James O'Neill's career as a touring actor, the family did not have a permanent home. They primarily lived in residential hotels, while James and his acting company were on tour or performing in New York City. The houses on Pequot Avenue were the O'Neill family's only permanent residence, but it was only a summer residence. And during the school year, the boys were in boarding schools. New London was a very attractive town at the time, with a sewer system, modern hotels, paved streets, and regular steamboat and rail connections to New York and other cities. The town was growing as a resort community, and some summer visitors were settling here permanently. The O'Neills had invested well in real estate. Between 1885 and 1888, land values in New London increased between 50 and 200%. The house pictured here is the Monte Cristo cottage on Pequot Avenue, which became the O'Neill's family's final home in New London. James purchased a third piece of property on Pequot Avenue in 1886, which was adjacent to the other properties. Their third property included a 2-story structure, which you see here, that at one time had a store on the ground floor with living quarters on the second floor, a barn, and a structure that at one time had been a school. You see to the left of the image, sort of set back, there's a little part of the house that juts out to the side. That's the original school building that was moved and connected to the main part of the house. The family moved into this property, the third property, in 1900, after it had undergone significant renovations, and they had outgrown the smaller Pink House. The house on the third property is referred to now and then as the Monte Cristo Cottage, taking its name from James O'Neill's highly successful production and character that he portrayed for many years. The Monte Cristo Cottage is a setting for Long Day's Journey into Night, which is O'Neill's autobiographical play, and also the setting for All Wilderness. The Monte Cristo Cottage is currently owned by the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, which has restored the house and operates it as a museum, and is open during the summer months. The photograph here that you see here is of Eugene, Jamie, and James O'Neill on the front porch of the Monte Cristo Cottage. Eugene is about 11 years old at the time, and Jamie is about 21. The O'Neill family quite often had their meals at the Packard, which was a boarding house on Pequot Avenue, run by the Ripon family, just a short walk from the Monte Cristo Cottage. Beyond the Ripons and further down Pequot Avenue was New London Lighthouse, which was a strong presence in the neighborhood. First built in 1790, the tower guided shipping to the mouth of the Thames River. Nightly, the light flashed out, and during the region's frequent summer fogs, the light's steam-powered foghorn blared out. The foghorn was moved in 1909 to the new ledge light, which is situated on a ledge at the mouth of the river. Both of those lighthouses still exist today. The foghorn could be heard at the O'Neill family home, and in O'Neill's autobiographical play, Long Day's Journey into Night, the foghorn tormented the mother, Mary Tyrone, and she says, "It's the foghorn I hate. It won't let you alone," she tells the maid, Kathleen. "It keeps reminding you and warning you and calling you back. But it can't tonight. It's just an ugly sound. Doesn't remind me of anything." The O'Neill family's property was located on the fringe of the exclusive Pequot colony, a summer resort. The resort had grown up around the Pequot House, a summer hotel, pictured here, that opened in 1853. Overlooking Fisher's Island Sound and the mouth of the Thames River, the hotel attracted wealthy New Yorkers and drew an elite clientele from as far away as Washington, D.C. The Pequot House became so popular that it built cottages for extended rentals. Eventually, the Pequot House and its surrounding cottages could host approximately 600 people. The Pequot Hotel burned down in 1908 and was never rebuilt. But one of the remaining vestiges of the hotel's glory days that remains today is the Pequot Chapel on Montauk Avenue. That chapel was built so hotel guests didn't have to take the long trip into town to attend church services. Many of the Pequot Hotel's cottages are private year-round residences today. Also in the neighborhood is the now vacant Lighthouse Inn, which was built by Charles Guthrie, chairman of the Republic Iron and Steel Company, built in 1904 as his summer home and originally named Meadow Court. As a focus of their social activities, the prominent families who owned summer cottages in the Pequot colony established a Pequot Casino Association in 1890, and that's pictured here. They acquired waterfront property and built a spacious casino, which at the time meant really a clubhouse or like a country club. It contained tennis courts, a billiard room, a ballroom, and 2 dining rooms. And at the water's edge, a long pier ran out to a large gazebo built on a rock ledge in the Thames River. The Moonlight Pequot Casino serves as a setting for the prologue and epilogue of O'Neill's play, The Great God Brown, which was first produced in 1926. The Pequot Casino represented a social world where an Irish touring actor like James O'Neill and his family would never be welcomed. Two sections of the Pequot's casino remain today, and they are 2 houses along the water side of Pequot Avenue. They can be identified by the outcropping of rocks just off the shore, which is where the casino's gazebo sat. During his summers in New London, Eugene engaged in a number of activities, both with the summer elite and the downtown locals. And in August of 1905, Eugene wrote to Marion Welch, a young woman from Hartford, whom he had met while she was visiting one of the O'Neill's neighbors. And in his note, he says, and I quote, "I was up to one of the hops at the Pequot last Saturday night and danced with the fair ones. Not even fair. I was bored to death and said, never again for little Eugene. And by the 9 gods, I never will unless you or someone else that I know are there." The photograph you see now is a production photograph from O'Neill's only comedy, Our Wilderness, which was produced in 1933. In this scene, Richard, who had just graduated from high school, is engaged in conversation with a prostitute at a local bar. Our Wilderness is inspired by New London and many of the people O'Neill knew here. And this particular scene is very likely inspired by some of his own experiences. In the summer of 1906, after his graduation from Betts Academy, Eugene, age 17, and his older brother, Jamie, age 27, stayed in New London for the summer while their parents were in England on tour. O'Neill biographer Stephen Black says that, and I quote, "Jamie spent his summer drinking and whoring, and Eugene followed suit," end quote. Jamie, being 10 years Eugene's senior, was certainly capable of introducing his brother to the seamier side of New London. The center of New London's underworld was Bradley Street. Bradley Street no longer exists today, but it was near the city's commercial center, not far from the railroad station and the steamboat docks. If you're familiar with New London today, Bank Street ends at State Street. Bradley Street was located just across State Street, basically a continuation of Bank Street, and crossed through the current Parade Plaza and through the parking garage. At the turn of the 20th century, traveling salesmen reported that New London, and I quote, had the liveliest and most wide open red light district on the route from New York to Boston. Bradley Street was the district's hub, and ironically, the police headquarters was also located there. Addie Burns' place on Bradley Street was a particular favorite of the O'Neill boys, and Addie herself is immortalized in Long Day's Journey into Night as Mammy Burns. In Long Days, O'Neill mentions a prostitute by the name of Fat Violet who played the piano. In O'Neill's youth, there was a New London prostitute named Violet who played the piano. O'Neill's time in New London was not spent solely in bars and brothels. Here you see a photograph of O'Neill and some of his friends at Ocean Beach. O'Neill is the second from the right. O'Neill enjoyed the water, both swimming and rowing. James O'Neill had given Eugene a rowboat, and O'Neill was known to lie naked in his boat while floating out in the middle of the harbor. And he caused quite a stir when aboard passing steamers that, as passengers looked down into the boat. Margaret Kiley, who lived nearby the O'Neills, recalled O'Neill as, I quote, a fish, a regular water rat, forever playing around in the water, end quote. The Monte Cristo cottage gave O'Neill easy access to the water, because right across the street, currently there are houses today, but in the O'Neill's day in New London, there were no houses along the waterfront side of the street. And beyond the exclusive Pequot colony was Ocean Beach, another growing resort community. The trolley line was extended from downtown New London to Ocean Beach in 1892, which made it more accessible and popular. O'Neill and his friends spent many happy days along the boardwalk, dancing by the bandstand and watching fireworks displays during festivals. Another social outlet for Eugene was the Second Story Club pictured here. O'Neill is not in this photograph, but many of his friends are. The Second Story Club was a group of friends who gathered at Dr. Joe Gainey's second-story apartment above his office on Main Street. Main Street in the mid-1970s, the name was changed and it is now Eugene O'Neill Drive. Ed Keefe, Ice Casey, Hutch Collins, Scott Lindsley, and Art and Tom McGinley were members of the club, and many remained O'Neill's lifelong friends. The Second Story Club played cards, drank, and read from Dr. Gainey's personal library. During his travels abroad, Gainey had acquired first editions, many of them avant-garde works that were banned in the United States, including works by Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Lil Tolstoy, and many others. The Second Story Club was seen as New London's bohemian center, and it was through Doc Gainey and the Second Story Club that O'Neill was exposed to authors that were not readily available in the United States. He references many of these authors in his play, Wilderness, as books that the character Richard is reading, much to the dismay of his parents. One of the annual early summer events in New London was the Harvard-Yale boat race held on the Thames River in June. The crews raced in 8-oared shells over a 4-mile course, and the day of the race was referred to as Boat Day, brought out a large crowd of celebrants. The river would be crowded with all sorts of spectator boats, from canoes to large motor yachts. The shores were also crowded with spectators, and trains outfitted with bleacher-style seating facing the water, traveling up and down the length of the race, following the boats. There was no other event of this type in any other New England town, and the Harvard-Yale race continues to happen on the Thames even today. O'Neill used Boat Day as the backdrop for Act 8 in Strange Interlude, which was first produced in 1928. O'Neill is pictured here at Doc Gainey's cottage along the Niantic River in East Lyme, around the age of 24. During the summer of 1912, at his son's request, James O'Neill made arrangements for Eugene to have a job as a reporter, the New London Telegraph, one of the 2 newspapers in town. The newspaper offices were located on Union Street, just behind the Crocker House. Frederick P. Latimer, editor-in-chief and part owner of the paper, was willing to take O'Neill on, but the paper had not budgeted for an additional reporter, so James O'Neill subsidized O'Neill's salary. Eugene had great respect for Latimer and shared some of his early plays with the editor. Latimer recognized O'Neill's ability as a playwright and shared that with James O'Neill, but O'Neill was not recognized as a good reporter. He lacked a reporter's instincts and ability to capture the facts of a story succinctly. In addition to covering news stories, he contributed verse for the paper's laconics column, where he had more freedom to express himself. O'Neill only worked for the newspaper for a few months, but his relationship with Latimer continued while O'Neill remained in New London. The playwright continued to share his plays with Latimer, and O'Neill once said, and I quote, "He is the first one who really thought I had something to say and believed I could say it," end quote. O'Neill paid tribute to Latimer by partially basing the character of Nat Miller in Our Wilderness on the editor. The photograph you see here is O'Neill standing on the beach behind the Ripon House on Pequot Avenue on January 1st, 1914. O'Neill noted on the photo that the water temperature was 39 degrees and points out snow on the ground. O'Neill sent the photo to Dr. Lyman at Gaylord Sanatorium, where O'Neill was treated for tuberculosis. O'Neill had great respect for Dr. Lyman and wanted to illustrate to the doctor that he was following the doctor's advice of fresh air and exercise. It was in December of 1912 that O'Neill was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and on December 31, he went to Gaylord Sanatorium for treatment. The treatment for tuberculosis at the time was a lot of rest, fresh air, and a healthy diet. O'Neill was under the care of Gaylord's Dr. Lyman, who encouraged O'Neill to write. O'Neill's play, The Straw, is based on his experiences at Gaylord Sanatorium. He wrote the play in 1919, and it premiered in New London at the Lyceum Theater, which was on Washington Street. And in November of 1921, it was produced in New London in November of 1921, and then moved on to New York's Greenwich Village Theater. O'Neill sets his play, Long Day's Journey into Night, on a day in August of 1912, and it is inspired by the events surrounding his tuberculosis diagnosis. After 6 months of treatment, he was released from Gaylord and returned to the Monte Cristo cottage in June of 1913. And that winter, he stayed on in New London, living with the Ripons at the Packard. That is where he wrote his very first plays, including The Web, Thirst, Recklessness, Warnings, Fog, and an early draft of Bound East for Cardiff. The photograph here is a production shot of the Provincetown Players' New York production of Bound East for Cardiff. Bound East was O'Neill's first play to be produced, which was in 1916, first during the summer in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and then later that fall in New York City. Many consider that production the beginning of a new American theater, a theater of realism. It was the first American play to deal with working class people in a realistic situation and setting. The play was also the beginning of the Provincetown Players, which became a driving force for new American plays written in this new style. The photograph here is a production image from Morning Becomes Electra, which was first produced in 1931. New London and its residents inspired settings and characters of many of O'Neill's plays, including Morning Becomes Electra. Still standing today are 4 Greek Revival-style houses on Huntington Street in downtown New London that served as the inspiration for the men in residence in Morning Becomes Electra. The houses were built between 1835 and 1845 and were nicknamed Whale Oil Row due to the fact that the wealth of the original owners came from the whaling industry. Morning Becomes Electra contains many references to New London residents, places, and New London history. The play is actually a trilogy and is partially inspired by the Greek tragedy, or the Oresteia, by Aeschylus. Many think it was a success and the magnitude of this play that resulted in O'Neill receiving the Pulitzer, the Nobel Prize. Pictured here are Jason Robards and Colleen Dewhurst in the first revival of A Moon for the Misbegotten. A Moon for the Misbegotten also set in New London's environs, and the character of T. Stedman Harder is inspired by Edmund C. Hammond, who had an estate in the neighboring town of Waterford. O'Neill had a great deal of disdain for Hammond and the wealthy class that he represented. There are reports that O'Neill was chased off of Hammond's private beach on numerous occasions. O'Neill explored his relationship and feelings towards the well-to-do in one of his early one-act plays, Fog, which he wrote in New London. Ironically, the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center is located on the old Hammond estate. A Moon for the Misbegotten was the last play O'Neill wrote and the last one that was produced during his lifetime. World War II upset O'Neill terribly. He was working on the second act of the play when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He said that he had to force himself to continue work on the play once the war had started. He was able to complete a first draft by the end of the year, and he completed the surviving draft in 1943 while still living in California. The play was published before it was ever produced, and in the Random House first edition, O'Neill apologized for publishing the play in draft form, stating that it had not been produced and that there were no plans for it to be produced, since he was not able to give it the attention it required. O'Neill, with all of his plays, felt once they were written, they needed to go through a production process before they were finalized. O'Neill did not like the play, and his wife Carlotta thought it was an unnecessary sequel to Long Day's Journey into Night, which only a handful of people even knew existed at the time. It takes place 11 years after Long Days, and the main character is Jamie Tyrone, who is the eldest son in Long Day's Journey into Night. The Theater Guild convinced O'Neill to allow a trial production to be mounted in the Midwest, and it premiered in Columbus, Ohio on February 27, 1947. The play offended critics and censors due to alcoholism, Christian symbolism, charged sexuality, among other things. The play was shut down by a police censor after 2 performances. This was not the first play of O'Neill's that were challenged by censors, and in a few instances, his plays had to be performed in court before they were allowed to go on. Throughout his career, O'Neill challenged the norms. One of his plays had the first interracial kiss, another the first Black actor to have a leading role in a white theater company's play. The company had wanted a white actor to play the role in blackface, but O'Neill insisted on a Black actor being cast in that role. He was challenged in the courts and at times by the Ku Klux Klan. The revival of A Moon for the Misbegotten opened on Broadway on May 2nd, 1957. It was a huge success, but the producers would not have had the courage to mount the revival if it had not been for the success of the first production of Long Day's Journey into Night in 1956, the year before. This photograph from the original Broadway production of Long Day's Journey into Night, with Bradford Dillman as Edmund, Jason Robards as Jamie, Florence Eldridge as Mary Tyrone, and Frederick March as James Tyrone. In this autobiographical play, O'Neill named the character that represented himself after his deceased brother, Edmund. I want to wrap up here with Long Day's Journey into Night and its significance. This is O'Neill's autobiographical play, and as mentioned before, it is set in New London at the Monte Cristo Cottage in the summer of 1912. The actual events that inspire the play took place on December 31st, 1912, as I mentioned before. O'Neill wrote the play while living in Danville, California, and it was completed in 1941. He had requested that the play not be released until 25 years after his death and to never be produced. O'Neill had given a copy of the play to Random House's publisher with those instructions. Very few people knew of the existence of the play. It was thought that O'Neill felt that if it was released 25 years after his death, no one would recognize how autobiographical it was. In 1956, 3 years after O'Neill's death, director Jose Quintero directed a revival production of O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh, which was a huge success in New York. O'Neill's widow, Carlotta Monterey, saw the success of Iceman, decided she wanted to release Long Day's Journey into Night. Random House challenged her decision, wanting to abide by O'Neill's wish. But since Carlotta was in control of the estate, she took the play away from Random House and allowed it to be produced and also published by Yale University Press. It was first produced in Sweden in February of 1956, and then the New York production later that year in December under the direction of Jose Quintero. The play was another success and launched an O'Neill Renaissance. Many feel that if the play had not been released, O'Neill would have disappeared into obscurity. The play is considered by many to be the greatest American play. As mentioned before, the play is set in the Monte Cristo Cottage and takes place through the course of one day in one room. The photograph here is how that room appears today at the cottage. And the perspective of the play is as if the audience is looking into the room from the far window. And as I mentioned earlier, the one-room schoolhouse that was on the property that was moved and attached to the main structure is this particular room. The Monte Cristo Cottage is a unique place. There is no other place in the United States where you can actually visit the setting of a major piece of American literature. Scholars and theater artists from across the globe visit the cottage to gain a greater understanding of O'Neill's life and work. It is a gem in our community. And I hope through these photographs and some of the words that I've said that I've been able to give you sort of a little bit of an insight into the playwright, into the influences of New London, a little bit of New London history. He's a complex man, and it's a complex topic. Here's where I do sort of a shameless plug. If you'd like to learn more or read more, my book, Eugene O'Neill and That Old Devil Sea, is available through Bank Square Books in Mystic, Savoy Bookshop and Cafe in Westerly, and also their new Title IX pop-up store here in New London. It will give you some more insight into O'Neill's time in New London and other maritime communities. If you purchase a book through Bank Square Books and its affiliates, you're supporting a local bookstore, a local business, and a wonderful independent bookstore. So I'm going to post you can order it online, which is probably the easiest way to do it, and then pick it up at one of their venues, or they might even send it to you. So I will post that link if you're interested in the chat. And I am going to open it up for questions. And I am searching for the chat here. So I think the first question that I've had is, how did I get interested in O'Neill and his life? And maybe as O'Neill, it's a complex process. My father, when I was in high school, gave me a copy of O'Neill's 7/1 Acts of the Sea, which I had read. And then then when I was working in Mystic Seaport in 1988, which was the O'Neill Centennial, I was asked to direct some of O'Neill's sea plays at Mystic Seaport, which I did. And in doing that, and now I had a maritime history background, I realized I was fascinated by how realistic his plays were and how O'Neill really knew sailor culture and the life at sea. And so I really became fascinated about the things that influenced him. So sort of a long process of my master's thesis was on the topic, and then eventually the book and many, many other things. So so another question. I have, and I will read the question and then I will do my best to respond. I've read that although New London inspired O'Neill, he didn't really like the city and wouldn't come back to New London to dispose of the Monte Cristo cottage after his parents' death. Did he have a lot of mixed feelings about New London? I mean, he certainly did. And you know, I think it was a difficult time, and there are many things that I have not gone into about O'Neill's life. But his time here, I mean, his mother was a morphine addict, and a good portion of his growing up. But she did actually, what's interesting, I find really interesting, is the action of the play, Long Day's Journey into Night, takes place in 1912. And Mary Tyrone, or Eugene's mother's morphine addiction, is a key factor in that play. What many people don't know is that a year after those events, Ella O'Neill was able to kick her morphine addiction and lived a very good, productive life for a number of, about a decade, after that. But O'Neill, he returned to New London a couple of times. It apparently made him sad. But what's an interesting thing is if you go to St. Mary's Cemetery, that's where the O'Neill family plot is. Eugene is not buried there, but his parents are. There's a memorial there for Edmund. Jamie is buried there. And O'Neill lost his father, his mother, and his brother Jamie, all in about a 3-year period between 1920 and 23. And this was at a point when his career was really on the rise. He won his first Pulitzer Prize, in 1920. And so when I first went to the grave site, I mean, I knew all of these dates and I knew what happened to his family. But seeing, there's just one memorial stone there, and seeing all of the names listed on it, it just was a moving experience. So I think, you know, he had O'Neill had a mixed love and hate for New London. And the next question, anything more about Ella's family's ties in New London? You know, I'm sure there is more information about that, and I don't really know that. Her mother lived here to be near mother's sister, so Ella's aunt, and I believe Ella's mother died really just maybe a year after James and Ella started to live here. So there was not much of an overlap between them. Another question, any hints of whether James knew contemporary actor Richard Mansfield, who lived on Ocean Avenue? And I have not seen references, you know, that they did, but that they knew each other, but I have to imagine that they did. I mean, they both frequented the Crocker House. James O'Neill, the Crocker House was a favorite establishment of James O'Neill's. So, you know, I'm a stickler for citing sources and things like that. So I can't say categorically I know that they knew each other, but I can't imagine that they didn't. There might have been a kind of a competition between them too, as well. Next question, this is a tough one. Or, you know, how do I feel about the demolition of the Pink House last year? And I think it was a real shame. And, you know, I think, yeah, that's what I think. It's a shame. You know, there are structures that I feel should be preserved. And, you know, but I don't know the details behind that one. But it's anytime a historic home or house or, you know, disappears, I think it's a shame. And New London, you know, the whole urban renewal of New London, and we lost, you know, lots of great neighborhoods, but we also lost lots of great neighborhoods in New London through the hurricane of '38. The whole Ocean Beach area that O'Neill knew was completely wiped out as a community. So next question. Katharine Hepburn gave what many regard as one of the best performances in the film version of Long Day's Journey into Night. Did O'Neill's life here or elsewhere intersect with hers? I don't believe it did, but I don't know that for sure. They were of a certainly overlapping lives, but different generations. And I don't see any reference, haven't seen any reference of them actually knowing each other. So I hope I've answered your questions. And if there are any more, you can pop them into the chat. But if not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it back over to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen first, and I will turn it back over to Amy. And thank you all for joining us today. It's really great to see you here. Now that I'm looking at the screen, I see names, some people I know and some people I don't know. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for that great presentation. It's the second time I heard it, but it was just as good the second time as it was the first. To all of you joining us, thanks for your time, your questions, and for your support of the park. Our next virtual Stories from the Park will be the Resolute story, told by Steve Manuel, who's the executive director of the London County Historical Society. I'm sure many of us hear about the Resolute desk all the time in the Oval Office, but most of us probably don't know where that Resolute desk came from. So we will be learning about the HMS Resolute. It's a fascinating adventure about Arctic exploration in the mid-19th century. And we'll be hosting that next Sunday, the 28th at 2 p.m. as well. And lastly, just a friendly reminder that although water taxi season doesn't start until Memorial Day weekend, season passes and gift certificates make great gifts, and you can get them anytime at thamesriverheritagepark.org, where you can also make a donation. So we hope we'll see you again soon for another virtual Stories from the Park, and so long.